There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on. It's Melbourne Cup Day in 1984, and Kylie Maybury has just taken her two young daughters to the pub for the race that stops the nation. Home just after 4 p.m, they stop in at the apartment next door for some tea. Julia's on the phone to her mum in Albury, and 2-year-old Rebecca is busy playing, when the neighbour Lorna asks if 6-year-old Kylie can pop to the shops for some sugar. As long as she comes straight back, Julie says over her shoulder. Sitting at the kitchen table, Lorna has been teaching Kylie how to spell the words I love you. So off the little girl goes out the door with the phrase scrawled in biro up her arm. Kylie does buy the sugar at the store 150 metres up the road, but she never returns to Lorna's. Her body is found in a gutter in the early hours of the next morning. What police determine happened to her is unfathomable. It's a crime that shocks Melbourne and puts the whole country on edge. And it'll take 32 years and a series of bizarre and tragic twists to finally find her killer. I'm Gemma Barth, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them.
It's a pain that you can't describe. There's a hole in your heart. You can't make anything warm in there, but you can heal slightly around it, but you can't heal the wound.
That's Kylie Maybury talking in 2017, 33 years after the murder of her daughter Kylie. What happened to the 6-year-old is every parent's worst nightmare. The little girl was drugged, raped and murdered while ducking down the road to buy some sugar. And please take that into consideration when listening to this episode. It's a case that former Herald Sun journalist and true crime author Keith Moor has covered since the day Kylie's body was found. He has interviewed her grieving mother many times and considered her a friend. Keith joins us now. Keith, in the 80s, Kylie Maybury lived in a suburb of Melbourne with her 2 little girls. Can you tell us about their family?
Yeah, look, Julie was a single mum, but she adored her 2 daughters and was a very good single mum. I've been to her house a number of times since the murder. And the day Kylie disappeared was Melbourne Cup Day. She did what a lot of parents do. She and a girlfriend went to a local pub to watch the Melbourne Cup and then went back to the friend's house for afternoon tea. She adored her children.
So it was the neighbour's house, wasn't it? Can you tell us a bit more about the movements? So they went to Melbourne Cup at a local pub, and then they kind of came home, ducked over to the neighbour's house to have a cup of tea. What happened next in terms of the movements of Kylie and the rest of the family?
Well, look, it was about 4:30 p.m. when they decided to have a cup of tea after having watched the Melbourne Cup, and there was no sugar in the house. So basically, Lorna, the friend, said to Julie, look, is it okay if Kylie wanders down to the local shop, which was only 150 metres from the house? Kylie had been there before. Now, look, today you might think it's odd to send a 6-year-old girl down to the corner shop to get sugar. Back in 1984, it wasn't quite as odd. There was no streets to pass. Kylie had been to the shop before and knew the shopkeeper. So basically, Kylie turned up at the shop. Police spoke to the shopkeeper afterwards, and the shopkeeper remembered Kylie coming in and asking for the bag of sugar and plumping the coins on the counter. Kylie then walked out of the shop, never made it home.
How quickly did Julie raise the alarm? Because obviously she would have been expecting Kylie back within, a few minutes if it's only 150 metres away.
Yes, look, it wasn't long, 10 to 15 minutes. She went out of the shop and wondered what had happened, and the shopkeeper said, yes, Kylie has been in the shop and left. And obviously that's when Julie started to panic and, started searching for herself, and then eventually the police were called.
Were they able to trace Kylie's steps beyond making that transaction with the shopkeeper for the sugar?
No, there was a witness that they found that thought they saw a girl looking like Kylie getting into a white vehicle and being driven away. It turned out decades afterwards, when that vehicle was tracked down to the perpetrator, that eyewitness was correct, that Kylie had indeed got into a car with a man.
At 12:45am the next morning, there was the discovery of Kylie's body. Firstly, location-wise, can you tell us about how far away that is from where we're talking about?
It's within 650 metres of the perpetrator's house and not far from where the bag of sugar was bought, less than a kilometre. And it was a fire brigade electrician, Neil Rickwood, who was driving home after night shift, that saw what he thought was a body lying face down in the gutter in Donald Street, Preston. He then went home and spoke to his father. His father came back and they then rang police, and it was 1:15am when the first police officers arrived at the scene. And a search found out, remembering this is the early hours of the morning after Melbourne Cup Day, obviously there was a massive search for Kylie from about 5:30pm, 6pm, where all the streets in the area were searched, including Donald Street, where the body was found. And that body wasn't there at 7:30pm on Melbourne Cup night. And of course, the body was there shortly after midnight, or around about 1am. So what the police presume, and later found out to be correct, was that whoever took Kylie had held her prisoner somewhere for a number of hours before dumping her body in the gutter.
Which is harrowing to think about, 6 years old. Where were you in all of this? Because you were covering the story as a reporter at the time.
Yes, look, hadn't been at the Melbourne Herald, which is an afternoon newspaper, very long. I joined it in 1983, and obviously being fairly new at the job, you tend to get the worst shifts.
Yep.
So I was on the midnight to dawn shift, based out of Russell Street Police Headquarters. The media had rooms there. I was sitting in there at about the 1:30 mark, listening to the police scanner, which in those days you could. I believe it's illegal now and you can't, but then we used to listen to it, and my ears pricked up when there was a code 33. Code 33 was code for a dead body, and it gave the address. So I jumped in the car and drove out there. When I got there, there was a lone policeman standing there with blue tape surrounding what looked like a body covered in a blanket in the gutter. There was me and my cameraman, and there was a pool cameraman that Channel 7, 9 and 10 employed to do such things as well, and one other reporter from Channel 10 from memory. And we basically stood around waiting for the homicide crew to arrive. And that often takes a while, that obviously there's a crew that's on call. So whilst there'd been an inspector from the local area who'd preserved the scene, it was obviously once the ambulance came and found that she was indeed dead, the homicide crew had to be called. So I was there when the homicide crew arrived with the coroner, Hal Hallenstein. First thing they did was take the blanket off. Now, it's not that you want to look, but you have to as a journalist. You've got to take it in. And I'm already thinking, gee, I'm going to have to fill this because it's an afternoon newspaper by, my deadline was about 9 o'clock in the morning. And I'm wondering how long it's going to be before the homicide crew will tell us what's going on. So the blanket comes off, and I obviously see that it's the body of a young girl. She's fully clothed, lying face down in the gutter. Her left arm was underneath her body, and her right arm was sort of resting on the pavement. The homicide crew and the coroner inspected what they could see of the body, and then I presume the coroner asked for the body to be turned over. So when the body was turned over, her arm went plop over, and it banged down, and I was close enough to actually see the body turning over, and it just reminded me of a rag doll, this tiny little girl's arm flopping over. And again, you don't want to look, but you have to in case there's a knife in the chest or whatever, and you don't know how much the homicide crew are going to tell you. So you've got to soak up as much from the scene as you can, because you've got to write a story about it. The homicide crew did come across and did give us a few details. I then went back and wrote the first story. Then I found out there was going to be an 8 a.m. press conference where more details came out and an appeal to the public for help. So I went to that and filed that story. So it's about 10 or 11 in the morning, and I've been at work since midnight. So I then drive home, and as I walk through the door, my wife said, "Oh, have you had to do the awful Kylie Maybury story?" And I went and started crying, as I do now, after 40 years. Now, maybe it's because I have a child that's 41. I've just become a father for the first time. That you wouldn't be human, in my view, if you weren't affected by seeing the dead body of a 6-year-old girl who you then found out had been raped and murdered. Maybe it was because I was a first-time father. Maybe it's just because I'm human. But for months and possibly years afterwards, I kept seeing that little arm flopping over. And I made a pledge to myself on that day that I'm going to keep writing about this case. I'm not going to let it slip by like lots of other stories. So after 2 or 3 days, I said to the homicide crew, look, there's nothing new. We're really keen on the story. I don't want to knock on Julie's door unannounced. Can you just check with her? I obviously didn't want to cause her any more stress, whether she's happy to do an interview with us, and we'll obviously make it a plea to the public for help. They contacted Julie, and Julie graciously agreed to see me, and I went out to see Julie, and in talking to her, built up a bit of a rapport, and strange enough, found out that we share the same birthday, May the 27th, and Julie said to me then, will you stay on this story? And I said, yes, of course I will, Julie. I said, I'm really affected by this. Yes, I will. So I then did a 1-year anniversary piece. Julie then sadly got into drugs and had a succession of awful blokes that used to commit violence on her. And me and Peter O'Connor, who was the homicide squad detective dealing with the case at the time, became more like social workers to Julie. She leaned on both of us. So basically, Julie and I formed this bond. She then met a nice bloke who moved to Queensland, and I didn't hear from her for a couple of years. You're busy doing other things. Lots of other stories pop up. It was on the 5th anniversary that Julie rang me from Queensland and said, oh, Keith, sorry I haven't been in touch, moved up to Queensland, got my life together again. It's the anniversary this coming weekend. I was wondering if you put some flowers on the grave. So I said, of course I will, Julie. I then put flowers on the grave, and that became a bit of a tradition. She would ring me and I would put flowers on the grave. And then, look, it was probably 8 or 9 years where she just disappeared totally. And it wasn't until the 30th anniversary, 2014, that Julie rang me again and said, Keith, are you still at the Herald Sun? I said, yeah. And she said, it's the 30th anniversary coming up. And it had actually escaped me that it was. As I say, you get busy on other things. And she said, there's been nothing written for years, Keith, and that's because nothing new had happened. Will you do a 30th anniversary piece?
Let's go back to when Kylie's body was first found and an autopsy was performed, obviously in the day or two afterwards. And a warning to listeners that it's not very nice to listen to. But Keith, can you tell us what they were able to determine happened to Kylie?
Yes, look, at the autopsy, it was discovered that Kylie had been given Valium because the drug was found in her body, and Julie was asked whether there was ever any Valium in the house and could she have accidentally given it to her, and Julie assured them that no, that wasn't the case. They weren't able to establish a direct cause of death. They presumed she was suffocated, but sadly, and apologies for this, she had shocking internal injuries which could only have been inflicted by the rape. The injuries were just absolutely awful. In fact, the senior detective Glenn Wolfe, who was the homicide squad detective who took over the case, said, first of all, about the comprehensive search for Kylie, which included Donald Street. He told the coroner it has to be concluded that the body was not left there until very late at night. There were no external indications of violence, but she was sexually penetrated and suffered internal damage. The coroner's court toxicologist examined specimens taken from Kylie's body and discovered she'd recently taken the Valium, which obviously suggests that the kidnapper had drugged her before raping and killing her. What proved to be what ended up solving the murder was they were able to get semen samples from Kylie's body and her clothing. And at the time, DNA hadn't even been heard of. It wasn't used anywhere in the world until 1987, which, just as a side issue, that was a case in England where 5,000 men in a small English town where two 15-year-old girls had been raped and murdered, they got the whole village to submit to a DNA test. And it actually led to the freeing of the man who'd been charged with it because it wasn't him. And it was another 5 years before DNA was used for the first time anywhere in Australia. So obviously the perpetrator of this wasn't concerned about leaving his bodily fluids because he had no idea that one day the technology might exist to do something with that. And this is a praise to the Forensic Science Lab, who in 1982, so 2 years before Kylie was raped and murdered, the head of the biology lab said, look, whilst we can't do anything with these semen-stained underpants now, or this blood-stained balaclava from the armed robbery, let's just freeze it and see if one day technology catches up with that. And they actually bought this massive fridge and put it in the corner, and over the next 10 to 15 years, there was nearly 2,000 samples from 582 unsolved rapes that were just stored in that freezer. And they obviously intended, once DNA came to the fore, to one day test those samples, but like most forensic science labs around Australia, they were underfunded. Hot cases take priority over cold cases. So basically that freezer just sat there until Graham Ashton, who became the Chief Commissioner, was appointed as the head of the Forensic Science Lab in 2009. And I actually interviewed him about getting the job. And I said to him, have you heard about the freezer? He said, yeah, look, I've heard a couple of people talking about the freezer. What is it? So we then got one of his assistants in who explained how there was all these samples sitting there that had nothing done to them.
How incredible that they had the foresight to do that.
Well, yeah, incredible, yes. And sorry they didn't have the time to actually test them at that stage. But that actually might be a bonus because obviously being able to extract DNA from very small samples has got better as every year has gone. And it wasn't until Graham Ashton became Assistant Commissioner for Crime and he had the power to actually form a task force that he did form a task force and he said, I want every one of those 2,000 samples tested. So basically they did, and it took years to get all the samples out. They then, of course, put those samples on the DNA database and on the first day got 130 cold hits.
Wow.
A cold hit is when someone that isn't even a suspect, the DNA from the crime scene matches the DNA from the person. And a lot of those cases are still going through the courts now. The last time I checked, about 5 years ago, scores of people have been convicted because of that DNA freezer.
Wow.
It just shows what a great thing DNA is.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with ex-journalist Keith Moor. Up next, we discuss the series of unfortunate twists that evolved following the investigation into who was responsible for Kylie Maybury's murder. There's quite a few unfortunate twists in this case that I want to expand on, and I want to start with Kylie's grandfather, John Moss, who was incorrectly accused of the crime, wasn't he?
He was, and it was actually by Julie's brother Mark Maybury who accused his own father, John Moss, and he actually made a statement to the homicide squad very soon afterwards. Again, as I'm sure I don't have to tell you or your listeners, that in any given murder, the closest family members have to be considered first and eliminated because most murders are committed by somebody known to the person. So he was a suspect from the start because Mark nominated him as one, but also he had a few weird sexual quirks that his wife spoke about. He liked dressing in women's clothing. So he became a suspect and was interviewed at length by the homicide squad, but he had a cast iron alibi, so it obviously wasn't him, but sadly, he committed suicide in October 1985, just prior to the first anniversary. He got in a car and drove away and killed himself and left a suicide note in which he said the pressure of being considered a suspect for killing Kylie had got to him too much. And then, lo and behold, Mark Maybury, who shared his father's love of wearing ladies' clothing. Police became aware of that. He'd also been in jail a number of times. He was a heavy character. He had tattoos all over him. So he also had to be treated as a suspect. And he ended up killing himself as well. And of course,
wasn't either of them.
It wasn't him. So, you've got Julie's dad and Julie's brother both killing themselves under the pressure of being considered a suspect for the Kylie Maybury murder.
That brings us to Robert Arthur Selby Lowe, and he became a suspect in this case after the murder of another 6-year-old in 1991. What happened with him? How was he linked to the case, and what happened next?
Yes, well, Robert Arthur Selby Lowe murdered Cherie Beasley in 1991. She was a 6-year-old girl, and he became a suspect because there was a number of similarities in that both girls were 6, they'd both been dumped in similar areas. Robert Arthur Selby Law worked in the area of Preston, delivering, and Kylie's strawberry shortcake little handbag that she had with her when she went to get the sugar had been found near where Robert Arthur Selby Law lived. So basically, there was circumstantial evidence there that you think, look, fortunately there aren't many offenders who rape and murder 6-year-old girls. So the fact that there's 2 6-year-old girls who've been raped and murdered in similar circumstances, of course he had to be a suspect. Now, by this stage, they had DNA from Kylie's body, so all they needed was Robert Arthur Selby Law's DNA, remembering he was already convicted and sentenced to life in jail. At that stage, police didn't have the power to force him to give his DNA, so the Victorian government was approached, and the Victorian government introduced legislation whereby about 3,000 prisoners who hadn't had their DNA taken were going to be forced to give their DNA, and they were obviously murderers, rapists, armed robbers, very serious criminals. And Robert Arthur Selby Law was going to be the first cab off the rank for that when the legislation was passed. Legislation gets passed. Victoria Police then go to Robert Arthur Selby Law and get his DNA. He then, at taxpayers' expense, mounted a constitutional challenge to the validity of the Act in the High Court.
Wow.
Can you imagine how much it would cost you and I to mount any sort of High Court challenge? Yet he was granted legal aid to do that. And that only strengthened the opinion of Julie, who I spoke to about it. And she was in court, as was I, the day because he had to go to the magistrate's court to say, I'm not going to give my DNA because I'm mounting this challenge. And that's when the magistrate basically said, OK, we'll have to wait until that challenge happens. So Victoria Police then had the options of opposing that in the High Court, which would cost taxpayers a heck of a lot of money as well and would take years because it takes a long time to get such a case on. That Ron Iddles, who was the head of the cold case squad at the time, thought outside the box, and he thought, if we're going to spend all that money pursuing this in the High Court, it would be really nice to know whether he actually did do it and we're going to get a match. So, and knowing it would take years before they could legitimately get his DNA under the Act, he decided to ask a prison officer, while Robert Arthur Selby Law was out of his cell, to go into Robert Arthur Selby Law's cell and seize his hairbrush, his comb, and a couple of his razors to get it tested surreptitiously. Now, I'm in the loop. I've got a good rapport with Ron Iddles, and because I'm covering the case, I was aware that this was happening, and I'm sworn to secrecy not to write about it. They trust me, I trust them. So I'm waiting for Ron Iddles to ring me with the results, and I've got the story already written. And I'm thinking page 1 lead, man shot, solved after all this time.
So was Davies, a witness or a suspect?
So basically, in 1984, he was a person of interest immediately, simply because he had convictions for sexual assault and violence, and he lived in the area. And at the time, police interviewed not just him, and he said that he was at his brother's house. And there's a statement from the sister-in-law saying, yes, he was here all afternoon because it was Melbourne Cup day and he didn't leave till way after she'd disappeared. So he was cleared in 1984. And then in 1997, there was a call to Crime Stoppers where he was nominated as a suspect at the time. Now, at the time, all that person did was ring anonymously and say, you should have a look at Gregory Keith Davies over the Kylie Maybury murder. And what police later found out, as did I, because I interviewed him, was it was one of Gregory Keith Davies' brothers.
Oh, wow.
Who'd always thought maybe it was him simply because he knew the background. I mean, he didn't know for sure. So basically in 1997, that brother had wrong Crime Stoppers. Crime Stoppers then give it to the homicide crew. And again, this isn't a criticism of the police in 1997, but they didn't interview Gregory Keith Davies a second time. They just went to the file, found out why he was eliminated in 1984, and that was because he had a cast iron alibi that was given by his sister-in-law. So again, they eliminated him again in 1997 without speaking to him. But again, they didn't know it was the brother. Like if they'd known that it was his own brother dubbing him in, they would have made it a priority. And plus in 1997, DNA was still in its infancy, so he gets away with it again in 1997.
Who was Gregory Keith Davies in 1984? Can you paint a bit of a picture of who he was in that community?
Yeah, 1984, he was a very accomplished singer. He sort of did the circuit. He sort of dressed himself up as a cowboy and did sort of pub sessions. And he was one of 11 brothers, lived at home with his mum. He had spent time, and it's why he became a suspect. In 1970, a girl was attacked on the Hurstbridge line, and she was so badly injured that she ended up having to give her evidence from a wheelchair in the Melbourne Magistrates Court. And what she said to the court was she was sitting in the compartment when a man came up and started hitting me on the head with a hammer. Fell to the floor, went back into the other part of the carriage, then he came back and hit me on the shoulder with a hammer once more. The next thing she remembered was being in the ambulance. The doctor told the court she had severe depressions of the skull when she arrived at the hospital and that she was partly paralysed down her left side. And basically he went to jail for 10 years over beating her to a pulp. And at the time he was a 28-year-old welder who lived in Thornbury. He didn't do the full 10 years. And what some relatives of Gregory Keith Davies told me afterwards was that they were surprised that his mum in particular allowed him back into the home. And I also, during my research into the case, tracked down a number of victims of Gregory Keith Davies who told me of the sexual offending that he had been doing for a number of years against young girls that he had ready access to, and that his mum and a couple of other members of the family were aware of that and basically swept it under the carpet. And when there was if there happened to be a party at the house, then they just used to make sure that Gregory Keith Davies didn't go anywhere near any of the young girls that were there. And the sad thing is, this was both before and after Kylie was raped and murdered. So had the mum and had those other relatives chosen to dob him in years earlier, Kylie would be alive, and so would John Moss, and so would Mark Maybury, who killed themselves because they were treated as suspects. And one of the relatives who I interviewed a number of times said that Gregory Keith Davies' mum had blood on her hands, but she was the one that just said, let's keep this in the family. We don't want anybody to know about this. I spoke to one of the victims who said she and 3 of her friends who'd been sexually assaulted by him after they found out about him beating the 14-year-old girl and indecently assaulting her on the train, went to their parents and told them. The parents took them to the police. And according to them, the police talked them out of it and said, do you really want to go through all of this? If we charge them, then you'll have to give evidence in court and you'll have to relive that awful experience.
That's devastating.
The police officer who said that was dead by the time I became aware of that. But certainly I've spoken to a number of relatives of Davies who say it was common knowledge within the family what he was doing. Look, one of them did play a role in eventually solving the case.
After the break, Keith tells us about the development in DNA testing that helped solve the case. So this is 2014, and not long after that 30th anniversary, you did a piece. A review of the case was ordered. Why was that? Was that just because of the anniversary, because it was back in the media?
Well, it was, and it wasn't Julie. It was another relative contacted Boris Buick, who was then the detective in charge of the cold case squad. And they just rang and said, look, it's the 30th anniversary coming up of the murder of Kylie. Is anything happening? And he had to say, look, sorry, there's been nothing for years. There's nothing new at all. But he was so touched by the emotion in this person's voice that he made a pledge that he said, look, I'll have another look at the case, which basically means getting all the files out, going through all the material. And coincidentally, Julie had rung me and said, Keith, the 30th anniversary is coming up. Would I do a piece? So I then ring Boris Buick and say, okay, Boris, I don't know whether you're aware, but the 30th anniversary is coming up. Any chance of an interview? And he said, Keith, that's bizarre. He said, I've had a similar phone call, and it was from someone else other than Julie. So he said, I am going to reopen the case and have a fresh look. So that gave me the peg to hang it on. So I go and interview Boris and do a very big piece for both the paper and online. And again, included the Crime Stoppers number. There were lots of calls. And again, there was another anonymous call from somebody who didn't say he was the brother, But I since found out it was the brother, because the brother contacted me after Gregory Davis was charged and said, Keith, when I read your article, I felt I had to ring Crime Stoppers again, even though I'd done it years earlier and nothing had happened. So, again, all he said was, you should have a look at Gregory Davis. Had the police known it was his brother, they obviously would have gone much quicker, because it actually took about 18 months or so before they ended up knocking on Gregory Davis's door to ask him for his DNA, which was in 2016. When they did knock on the door, they were invited in. He was in his 70s then. He was 72, 73. His wife was 90, his third wife. And they just said, oh, look, we're having a look at the Kylie Maybury case. We're just getting DNA from everybody who was interviewed at the time. Can we have your DNA, please? And it would have been hard for him to say no, because his wife would have then said, why are you saying no? So he actually voluntarily gave his DNA. And as Paul Rowe, who was the detective that did it, told me afterwards, he said, when we send off those things, if it's a negative, you get an email from the forensic scientist. If it's a match, they pick up the phone and ring you because they're just as excited as you are. And he said he got that phone call saying it's a match. So they obviously went out and arrested Gregory Keith Davis. He initially denied it was him. And then when he was faced with all of the evidence, much to everyone's surprise, he ended up pleading guilty at the committal stage and obviously was then set down to be sentenced. In another, all these bizarre twists that keep happening has just reminded me of another one, in that his actual sentencing had to be delayed because the day before he was due in court, his testicles were scalded because some prisoners threw boiling water over him, which is a time-honoured punishment that pedophiles often get in jails. I don't want to give anybody ideas, but I think it's fairly well known that not only do they usually just throw boiling water over the pedophile, but they often pour some honey in there as well, which makes it stick.
Oh.
And he ended up, look, he was in hospital. He had burns to 50% of his body. And Julie rang me and said, why have they put it off? I was all ready up to go for sentencing. And she was delighted, God bless her, when I said, oh, the reason that it had to be put off is because somebody's poured boiling water over his testicles. One of the few times I've seen Julie smile about anything to do with Gregory Keith Davis.
Yeah, fair enough. Did we get any insight? Obviously, there was no trial, no cross-examination, that kind of thing. But did we get any insight as to why he did this? Was this just a crime of kind of he saw Kylie and decided to attack? Do we know anything?
Look, we don't know much because he claimed, and I certainly don't believe him, and neither did the judge, because the judge mentioned this. He says he can't remember. When he was interviewed by police, he said that he remembered being at the Melbourne Cup function, he remembered driving home, and he admitted that his route home took him directly past the shop where Kelly bought the sugar. He claims nothing after that. So he never admitted that he picked her up. He never admitted having done anything to her. But I interviewed his daughter, who I have to call Jill because she doesn't want her real name used. Again, she contacted me after I'd written so many stories. And I went out to see her, and she told me that her dad had basically never had any contact with her. Jill's mom had been going out with Gregory Keith Davies for about 18 months when she accidentally fell pregnant. He then disappeared as soon as Jill was born. But when she found out what he was charged with, she felt she needed to confront him. So before he was sentenced, Jill actually went into Port Phillip on November the 6th, 2017, which was exactly 33 years since her father had abducted and raped Kylie. And she spoke to him about it. And again, he said the same thing. He said that he couldn't remember what happened. So she knew what her father had been doing. She did go to see him twice and then ditched him after that. But I think she just wanted to look him in the face and try and get him to admit it. But she also wanted to use the pages of the Herald Sun through me to make an apology from the family to Julie. And Julie graciously accepted that, and I put the two of them in touch together. And not that the daughter could be held in any way responsible or can really apologise on behalf of her dad, but she did, and Julie appreciated her doing that.
Kylie's mum, Julie, did she recognise Davies at all?
Well, look, she didn't recognise the name, and it wasn't until, obviously she knew the name, and it meant nothing. And I was with her the day he pleaded guilty, and at that stage, she didn't recognise him. She obviously saw him in court. And it wasn't until I started doing research for a story to be published after he's sentenced, when obviously you can see a lot more about somebody once they've been sentenced and you know there's not going to be a trial. And I found out where he was living at the time and then worked out how close it was to the body and took pictures of the house. And I went to see Julie and said, oh, look, Julie, I've found out where Kylie was almost certainly held. And when I showed her the picture, there was just look on her face, and she said, "I've been to that house." And I said, "Julie, what do you mean you've been to that house?" And it turns out that, first of all, she used to deliver pamphlets in the area when she was a kid, but one of her girlfriends knew one of Gregory Keith Davies' brothers because he was one of 11 kids. And Julie had actually been to the house. She doesn't remember ever speaking to Davies, but she does remember speaking to the mum. But she also then said, and this was before she knew that he was a guitar player, she said, one of the funny things was, often when I went to the house, I could hear guitar playing in the background. And I'd answer to Julie, "That's what he did. He was a guitar player." So another bizarre happening is that Julie Maybury had been to the house where her daughter was almost certainly held and murdered.
So what did he get? How did the sentencing go?
Yeah, so the sentence was delayed because of the attack on his testicles, but when he finally did get to court, he was jailed for life, and 73 at the time, so he'll die in jail. No great loss to society, in my view.
Did any of those other women, once girls, who had all of those other allegations, did they ever press charges against him after the fact, after everything that happened?
Yes, I tracked down one of those victims and travelled to see her when I was preparing this stuff, and she told me that she and a number of people that she knew, all young girls, told their parents about what he'd done to them. And it wasn't until 1996 when they came forward, because they were adults by then and they were very young girls when it happened. And Davies was actually charged with sexually assaulting the girl I spoke to and 5 others. And he was jailed in 1996 for 2.5 years. So that's obviously a long time after Kylie had been murdered, but the actual offences took place before and after Kylie was murdered. And he got out after only 16 months. And what she told me at the time was, "I cried that day when I found out he got out after just 16 months for what he did to me and the other child victims. He ruins our lives and goes to jail for 16 months. That's just not right. He sexually abused me and 5 other children and gets a slap on the wrist. That's not justice. It's a joke, a sick joke."
Well, he won't be getting out now. He will, as you say, die in prison. Did finding Kylie's killer give Julie any sense of closure? Have you spoken to her since?
Yes, I have. And look, it did. I mean, she said, look, it obviously can never bring Kylie back, but he was actually sentenced the day after my birthday, which is also Julie's birthday. And I sent her a birthday card in which I said, let's hope that finally there's going to be some justice for Kylie. And indeed there was. And, she was obviously happy with the life sentence that he got. But she again said, and she then was aware of the brother having contacted Crime Stoppers, not just in 2014, but years earlier. And she just said she was really dirty on that brother, even though he did the right thing eventually, but also the mother, that they just kept it, let's keep it in the family. So there was a number of people within the family that just didn't want it to come out, didn't want the bad publicity, and felt that they could handle the situation by trying to separate him from having any access to girls. And Julie said what a number of the victims said, if only somebody had dobbed him in earlier, all of those lives wouldn't have been traumatized the way they were. Kylie be alive, her grandfather be alive, her uncle be alive, and those girls wouldn't have gone through what they went through.
Lastly, I just wanted to ask you about how this case has stayed with you. We obviously heard the emotion in your voice talking about Kylie, but to cover a story from the very start and then decades down the track to find the killer, to see them put behind bars, what's it been like for you being so closely involved in this case?
Look, it was one of the proudest days of my very long journalistic career, the day I was in court with Julie, sitting next to her, and Julie's husband Bruce was there at the time, to find that finally Kylie had got justice. I started off covering the story as a reporter, but it's one of only 2 or 3 cases that I have covered for decades where you don't become a reporter to the victim's wife, husband, whatever. I became a personal friend of Julie's, and I know she relied on me, and she relied on Peter O'Connor, the homicide squad detective, as well. And I think we helped her cope and eventually have a very rewarding life and meeting a nice husband, and Bruce was wonderful. Sadly, Julie is no longer with us. In an interview earlier, when she found out about Robert Arthur Selby-Law wasn't the person that did it, she said, "Keith, my fear is that I'll die before anybody is found guilty of Kylie's murder." So at least, and she was very frail by the time Gregory Keith Davies was sentenced to life, she died a couple of years later.
And at least she got to, like you say, see her daughter's killer put behind bars.
Yeah, and look, the other thing is the wonderful thing about DNA. It shows that the cold case, they never do give up. No case is closed until there's a result.
Thanks to Keith for helping us to tell this story. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted and produced by me, Gemma Barth, and Tahli Blackman, with audio design by Thom Lyon.